teaching eternal rebeginnings, how to do it better, how to help better, how to build better the future generation of music thinking, of music rethinking. Not necessarily on the surface of the scheme of things with fashions, but mostly what is the way to connect the hearing to the making, the reading, the understanding of the reading. It's not just to analyze and separately play and separately compose and separately imagine perhaps interpretations that englobe improvisations either for purposes of old tradition or just in an innovative way. Everything is relative in innovation when we talk about an art that persisted for so many centuries, through even in Western music, European one, through a common tonal rule, so to say, of the game, but which allowed so many different stylistic expressions. So all this is evident to all of us. The difficulty is how to contextualize the hearing within the time period of which we are, let's say, distant, but while playing, we are immersed in. And this immersion calls for a certain exclusion of everything we've heard since. What is the consequence of a dissonance compared to a consonance in different parts of the world, in different times of the world? For classical music, it is almost as if there are so many languages, some dead tongues, but mostly appropriations of styles that travel around because of musicians who in fact bring the essence of the human expression, written or not, folkloric, jazz, in the Baroque music. It was obviously the time period where the different explorations of the genres were also in the birth from the Renaissance and the opera, and the capacity of expressing so much through instruments like the keyboard, which were officially in lieu of the text and the lyrics. And therefore the psychological suggestion of the emotion or the imitation of a dance stylized or of a song, of an aria, brings us to the essence of the humanity in us. So beyond this easy universality to call it an universal language, because in fact it is its own language more than only the reflection of everything else that it's supposed to imitate. Just like in an interpretation, you play the music itself rather than the commenting of how much it means to you while you play it. And if you don't involve, you appear distant. And if you're over involved, you appear not to let the music express itself. Of course, if the notation gave all the answers, we would not have this beautiful variety of points of view. And to come as well as past, recorded now that we can, but unfortunately not in the centuries when it was composed. After all, a piece was composed, the composer died, and the work started living through the performers, the audiences, now the recordings, and then all different forms where it takes part, it becomes part of our daily life of culture, regardless where we are from and what we are involved in. Mona Lisa, the Eiffel Tower, democracy, all these kind of things which are part of the world heritage, from culture, from thinking patterns, from ways of organizing our values system. And of course we can and we will rethink it, and that's not a question about keeping it rigid. But I'm deeply convinced that expressing music through different cultures from which people come, from Asia, from of course Europe, from America, from Africa, from all over the world, it's not to sound alike, it's to be really bringing their own funnel point of view of this dissonance, other cultures, the French dissonance, let's say, because this other culture created through its civilization this situation where this music existed, and to just reproduce it mechanically or gymnastically without the spiritual and its very aspect of emotional and intellectual thought process is to consider it out of context with our point of view of today very difficult and almost in fact fallacious, because how can we really be in the ears and the hearing and the music making of the musicians of the past who lived in their own time and not in their own past as much as we do compared to our present? Perhaps because of the easy access, or perhaps because of the capacity of curiosity that we have to reinvest these ancient times and see what they heard, what they sung, what was the ritual singing or playing, what was the necessity of music as a societal situation, the rituality of it, or as well as the way to commemorate events or to celebrate them, and of course to face the inevitable finitude, which is the humanity's essential goal. Meanwhile, there is this incredible incentive toward the few instance on the incarnated life, if you want to call it so, the urgency to give a poem, a music, a painting, a political order, a thinking societally. It all englobes in one. It's not so much only separated elements of humans who just look at their own. Of course, you have the larger interests of humanity always went through power and ownership and all kinds of engines of capacity to rule things, energy and the way things at the global level work. But nevertheless, when you look at the history, and we are in history in classical music, but in the dailiness of it, because while we play the music of the past, it's present, our present, within our own presence. It's almost like being in a sort of a jet lag constantly. The music talks to us a lot about their thoughts and their ways of thinking and their ways of expressing the universal feelings, love, hate, hope, and in a different way, but it's variations on the theme. And I find it fascinating when we have, me as a teacher, I find that I can help with phrasing, articulation, pedaling, breathing, fingering, shifting dispositions, anticipation of gestures to memorize in the muscular memory, so that you can become reliable when affected by, let's say, stage fright or just the worry of not doing it well compared to how much it's supposed to be. And because you love it, you don't want to botch it. By not botching it, you're afraid of assuming it, and then you're afraid to offend people's opinions. If you only play for those who know the piece, then of course you will. But if you play mostly as a narrative storytelling to make people love a piece or understand a piece they don't know, it's like watching a film without knowing the script. You want to be told a story, just like a child wants to sleep, you tell him a story. And this is in a way something very beautiful, and I think that erudite as one can be, one has to remain at the level of narration. Of course, the culture is not something you demonstrate in the sound, in the phrasing, it's something you incorporate in your being, how you construct your structure, how you understand the proportions, how architecturally you bring the music to the audience. In other words, you bring the refinement of your studies as a respect to the audience who might not be and shouldn't be aware of it, but who becomes in a way educated while not in a class as an education, but is educated by the sheer curiosity of humanity and desire to love, desire to be seduced in the highest sense of the word, to be brought in a rupture of disbelief where the storyteller becomes the story as an actor becomes the part, and therefore through the lines the story itself. And so you embody during few perhaps ephemeral minutes a storytelling of a Mozart, a Haydn, a Beethoven, a Schubert, a Schumann, a Debussy, a Ravel, a Haydn, before and after. And you feel like each time, well, authenticity to the detail is essential when we work, because we want to be honest towards the intent of the composer. The composers didn't always survive so long. Bizet died shortly after Carmen was considered by the reviews a terrible fiasco. Schumann died very early and didn't see his works really become part of this world stage through Clara for almost 4 decades after his death. In a way, they were composed in quick succession, and then they took time to place themselves in the musical world's world heritage. And in a way, the tempi, the phrasing, the interpretation evolved from the original intent, most likely at the birth, because you see the growth. You see the adult in the child, and you see the contradictions that it can bring, because somehow the dialogue with the audience can be a rejection or an acceptance. Of course, you can help it with interpretational ways of bringing it closer to the audience, but generally the audience chooses to like or not, and then organizers choose or not to fill the audience seats in order to get their seasons made with pieces that the audience will like to spend money to go hear or rehear or discover or rediscover, if it's different staging of the same opera or a different interpretation of same concerto because of the performer. So it's like studies. You can organize curriculums. At the end of it is the teacher and the connection that incarnates to the teacher the knowledge. And the knowledge is not just facts that you can read on articles and you can memorize or you can integrate in your own writing, thinking, and therefore in your analytical understanding. I think it's to do with your personal connection with the piece, the experience of playing or thinking or organizing or recording the piece, or rethinking it and eventually even changing your approach after time, with or without argumentation, just with the playing. And then all this reaches the point where interpretation and the teaching are constantly evolving. Nothing is frozen in time. Nothing is more frozen in time than what we discover through the recordings, the trends of ways of playing the violin with sliding between the notes for expression or some type of vibrato, and then in other decades you don't hear that at all because the aesthetics have changed instrumentally, technically. The virtuosity of the 19th century is not the same of the 21st, the very meaning of it. And so it is a high responsibility when you embody all this erudite knowledge that of course one doesn't and shouldn't have the this lack of humility to assume that one knows, but even the little one grasps and one wishes to take the altruistic desire to transmit. Then some drops, even if they fall around, still reach their destination, and then in turn the student will say to their own students, you know, the values of my teachers, and not only one, perhaps several, even if contradictory in some aspects, were still meaningful because they're constructive of who I am. You don't choose your parents, you choose your mentors. You can be both, mentors and parents, if you choose them to be. It's not about rejecting, it's about accepting, but also in certain ways when you develop yourself, you start with who you are, and you are who you become. And if these mentors help you define who you become, either in rejection, either in acceptance, partial or complete, you can become a disciple or you can become a critique. And the critiques are very important because I find that when it's argued, when you have an argumentation that brings you to the point where you say, okay, perhaps this is the pulse for this piece, so we don't know the metronomic marking, but through the tradition of this stylistic imitation of the instrument and the meter compared to other examples that compare and contrast, we can come to a certain conclusion that this is the way it might have been considered then. Even if we don't play the same instrument, we don't have the same hearing, since we evolved in our musical language, since, for good or for bad, it has changed. But we revisit it with our ears of today, perhaps our impatience of today with the repeats, but in fact it is part of the expression. It's not redundancies, it's perhaps terms of endearment, echo cells or expressions of half major, half minor, moods in style, moods in subtlety. It's not about atonal or tonal, major or minor. It's way more subtle, modal in different ways. And if any music can remind you of any other music, is that there is a sense of receiving and then filtering and then transmitting through your writing or your teaching. And in fact, it has to be accepted. You cannot say, oh, this reminds me of this piece, therefore have been written chronologically earlier. There's no sense to redevelop or perhaps explore the same artistic domain. I think that is very some kind of artistic racism. Who's to say that we cannot have a composer who will tell us something more in the Mozart style that will be as valuable without to be an imitation, just a source from which it comes. Like you go to school for first grade to learn how to read and write your mother tongue, which generally you already speak by ear. Not all of those will become writers per se, but they can be readers, therefore on their own, informed, and then you develop a sense of criticism, so you develop a sense of understanding. And I think that if musicians remain unalphabetized as listeners, the performers have to bring them the grammar of music inserted in the piece which they're serving, which is already written and exists. And therefore, while you play it, you become the piece in the eyes of the listeners, in the ears especially. And how you bring those proportions and the repeats, it's not about being boring or not. It's not about artificially attractive by adding ornamentation or different dynamics at the repeats, as if you excuse yourself from playing it by some kind of obligation because, it's outside of our time. But no, I think that we need to, just like we want to explore the music of different cultures that are way beyond classical music, usually Western European centered, in the tradition of the centuries past, that pianists learn essentially, to open ourselves to the other cultures, how they hear the beat, the pulse, the upbeat, the downbeat, how is the rapport to the lyrics, how is the rapport to the voice itself, according to the language they speak, where they place the accents in their syllables of their words, and how many vowels and how they use them and how they combine them, the liaisons. Do you have upbeat, downbeat accents? How do you translate this in music, with or without lyrics? Or, in other words, to accept, to open yourself to cultures and to languages and to ways of thinking that are foreign to your own, instead of considering that the tradition of a certain, let's say, Western classical music tradition is sort of the essential, quasi-exclusive offer. Of course, the piano repertoire, more than others, is so diverse and so incredibly unreachably, seemingly endless, that to pretend to master, or if not at least explore in depth, the subtleties of the cultures and cultivate the sound quality for a sound by a Fauré compared to a sound by a Debussy, no matter how close they appear to be in terms of genetics and time periods, seen like this in a study book. In fact, they are universes on their own. that are independent from each other, even if they have common cultures, let less but they don't. So you have to be sometimes specializing in order to discover what is under the visible tip of the iceberg that is given to us to know, the famous works of the famous composers. What about the less famous works of the famous composer? What about the less famous works of the less famous composers? What about the works of the forgotten composers that you have to rediscover and bring to a certain, if you have conviction and love for them, to the standard of the repertoire by telling the audiences, perhaps in percentage or in full, that it's worthy of being known as the new music of today that I write or other write and I play, or the music of the past that people stop playing for whichever reasons, historical and aesthetic. It's a question about being, in fact, constantly open to be a spokesperson for the dead who are alive through the art which they left us. So perhaps we botch it, perhaps in best of our desires of authenticity, of study, of how it was supposed to be, reconstructing instruments of the past, or learning through the treatises how it was played, like C.P. Bach speaking in German when he writes his essay about expressive keyboard on the harpsichord playing. He speaks not spielen, play the keyboard, Klavier. He says instead of fantasieren, imagine on the keyboard. So that could induce to improvise. More of the less of the music of the past was improvised than notated, and the portion that was notated wasn't necessarily the reflection of what was improvised. Perhaps they didn't see in that a big difference in the ephemeral situation of short lives, which to us appear then, but today a longer expectation, whatever, that's relative. But nevertheless, all this brings us to wonder when we do music, is Schubert romantic or Beethoven classic, because they only lived 1 year apart after the death of the other, of course the one being younger. And so what? We cannot place them always in boxes for stylistic purposes chronologically. We try, we think, but I think ultimately I reject that, because not that we have to confuse them, but I think we have to bring to the student the capacity to bring out the essential of a phrase. What is decorative, what is not decorative, or eventually what is ornamental would be the embellishment. And that's the part also of the charm of the music, of the seduction of the music, is the perfume of the character, if you want. It's not something that you have to always put away and just reduce everything to the harmonic skeleton, without which you don't understand, of course, how the body functions physiologically. But then once you've put the nervous system and the blood vessels and the coating the skin and all the glands and the genetic material and everything, you have the soul. Can't capture it. The ancient Greeks thought it was the breath. Psyche, from psyche, comes from. It's something seemingly for which we all long without to really officially really do, but in fact constantly attempt, either for our own discovery, to know who we are or who we come from or go to. But in fact we don't know. We start the ride opening the eyes and the life already is in motion. And perhaps this, if there was an analogy with a tramway, you have few stops before the last, which you don't know when. And so you make the most of it to understand what you can from what was, to understand what you can perceive from what it is, nature, and the way we adore or fear things, and how we behave with each other with gentle sternness when we transmit, like a parent or a teacher, or with jealousy, anger when we are an opponent or an enemy. Competitivity is part of survival as well. But in the protected world of teaching, thankfully, these situations don't reach the point of such a critical situations where it's life or death, thank God not. Even if in the process of making, by analogy, we feel like it, oh my God, this teacher will kill me, or I'm not survive this jury, or this professional told me this and that criticism, I'm giving up. Pushing too hard, too far. When you know by intuition as a teacher that there is something in the character of the student that can withhold that pressure of expectation by themselves and for them, by the teacher and by themselves when they practice on their own. I always think about this when they're in between lessons. I often think about them. What do? They go in a practice room, they start playing, the acoustics are not great, or the piano doesn't sound good, doesn't feel well under their fingers. They just heard some great recording in their earbuds and then think that they don't get that sound. Just at the level of interaction with the sound, the tip of the fingers, the cushioning, feel that you feel from the note that you produce in the key, from above the key, or dynamically, or the articulation or the connection to the next note. And then how you receive it back in a hall, in a room, the feedback on the stage or in the room, and how you compensate, overcompensate with the pedaling because you want to put some juice or some sauce in the meal. It's not necessarily the most natural thing to do, to repeat and repeat over and over, details put together and then sections, and then it's like going from spelling bee by the letters, then by the words, and then by the sentence, and then the paragraph, and then the chapter, and then the book. And you memorize the details, but the sum of the details don't give the whole. The whole is gesture, it's a projection. It takes time to filter it, so perhaps the time of study is too short. But then you will rediscover, invest this education which you received, and reject some things, keep some in the revisiting of the piece you learned earlier, and you realize this is what I would like to go towards. And if you make a recording, then you funnel one direction. Then you can say afterwards, I shouldn't have gone this way, I want to see another option. There are so many ways of subtlety to suggest to a student, not that is wrong or right, but that this is the way to prepare yourself to love it, and then not allow the inevitable to happen. After all, nothing is fatalistic to be. The wrong note is usually in the performance of the keyboard, at least for sure, probably in the other instruments too, for different technical reasons. But when the piano is often an ill-conceived gesture in the muscular memory that reaches that. Either you're short of a note in the shifting, either you don't have exactly the disposition to play it and at the edge of the key if it's soft, and then you have to, the action of the piano allows to be played. So in other words, there's so many aspects to the technique serving the artistry serving the philosophy of the piece, the philosophy serving the understanding of the whole historic aspect of where this piece sits in its time period, and therefore the civilization of which it comes. It can go from the zoom in to zoom out and pan, scan, as they say for the films, and see the whole picture, not just the puzzle of the piece at a time, and how you put it together. And then blend it all in one, and then perhaps it's a revelation, and one day you say, I was wrong all my life. What if I can have a time machine and I go back with my erudite knowledge and discover that in fact they did play the ornaments on the beat, or they did play the trills from the real note. After all, I thought for the Baroque was from above because it's an appoggiatura repeated from the original trillo of the Monteverdi operas, of the repeated sound in the breath, ha, 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 imitated on the keyboard with a neighboring note. But how do we know? And ultimately, yes, okay, I would like to know, and I would love to come back if I could, if there is an afterlife and the composers revealed to me that I was wrong teaching them like that. I would like to come back and say to the students, it's on the beat. It's in fact before, it's on the real note. Perhaps I'll send a drop of tear on the key of when they play to tell them this is the note to start from. Because doubt is knowledge. Formulating the question is more than the answer. It's understanding that the destination is the trip itself. All these philosophical common sense things have to never be forgotten when you sink in the detail to practice, to repair, to prepare, to organize every detail of every note production that involves so many elements in order to produce it, and then what it means in the progress of a sentence, of a phrase. And I find it enthusing to be able to be a hyphen between intent of a dead composer and through the notation and the experience of performance, try to convince, if not convey rather, to the student a way that this is the proper way. How much rubato is tasteful, how much is tasteless, it's so much question of individual point of view. The same piece meaning so many different things to so many valuable musicians with their own convictions, more or less rigid for some, regardless. And I find that we have to agree to disagree to serve the students, because if not, I feel like we're locking them in patterns of thinking that will unfortunately necessitate for them to break those barriers one day by themselves and reject and say, why were our teachers or my teacher so strict about this or that? Okay, we give them a way of thinking right from wrong at the base level, because that's what guidance is. And then after that, we have to teach them about the tolerated, about the stylistically possible, about how you breathe, how you count, how you how you organize all these notes in order to make sentences, phrases, narrative storytelling. It's not about being barless and playing as you like or just by ear, nor is it by only reciting very detailedly all these, especially pianists with two hands play everything inevitably by reading it vertically, more like slices of beats, but to follow the layers of melodic lines that are in polyphony, in polyrhythmy, in polypulse, in poly everything, in fact, in polyphrasing. There is no secondary voice, there is only what you choose to be secondary. You bring it out or not. Creatively voicing is a way of interpretation, and perhaps for some people is considered an arrogance. You know, we're here to serve the text and the text only, and the text once served serves itself by the piece exists. We don't need to sort of add makeup to it to make it more attractive or less attractive according to our infatuation, even by love in the piece, by perhaps over stamping over it our own tastes, good or bad. And for some, it might be a very enticing, and they become followers of some interpreter. And for us, others is like not at all. And then something like the word text concept of editions is the neutrality. But there is no real neutrality other than the desire to go to the manuscript. And even in the manuscript, you find discrepancies, and it's fascinating to see how the crosses and that and why and then. So we have little of a window to the inner world of the composer's intent. But most of the time, we really don't understand. We accept. It's marvelous, it's beautiful, it's surprising, patterny or not, thus modulation, all this transition and this sense of proportion. I think all overall, teaching is sharing the marvelment with the student. And that is what wakes me up every morning. And hopefully I'm useful to them. Nothing but to give them stage confidence through technique in order for them to express all these musical emotions.